Dwarf Marine, that is a wonderful name. Dwarf Marine says, what are the pros and cons to have separate render passes for versus one multipass EXR? That is an excellent question. And to answer that question, I'm going to jump into Nuke and give you guys the tip of the day, okay? So answering your question about the speed of this thing, I'm going to show you what happens when you have a full CG render, which is multipass EXR, versus a CG render that is not. So this render is only the RGB, okay? So there's no passes on this. So all the EXRs are all separate as files, okay? And then the other render is all the EXRs are all inside the actual EXR. So you see, I have the subsurface scattering, I have the key light, I have the lighting, I have the matte reflection, I have the reflection, the rim lights, the shadows. Everything is inside one single EXR. So the difference being that I'm going to now try to cache 100 frames. So let's start. One of the things you need to understand is that on this one, if I go in here to my frames, you see this sequence, if I don't put sequence. So you see each EXR here has 45 megs. You see? Why do they have 45 megs? The reason for that is because each of the EXRs has all these passes built in together, okay? So it's really large because of that. And that's why it's 45 megs. So now if I look at the other render, if I look at this guy, you see each of the passes are actually all separated, and everything is between 900 kilobytes, 4 megs, 2 megs, 4 megs, 2 megs, 800 kilobytes. So as you can see, it's like 10 times smaller. If you're working on a network, picking up files of 4 megs is really fast because the networks are really quick picking up small files. But if you're in a network environment where you have to pick up files of 48 megs, it's going to take a lot longer. And especially if you're in a network that has only 100 megs per second, then basically you alone already are picking up half of the bandwidth of everyone else, okay? As opposed to if you're working on this file on a 100 meg connection, you're only picking up about 4% of the connection. That means you can have dozens of people working on that connection and you're not hogging the internet all for yourself. And now let me show you what happens if I try to play it back. This is not just a network issue, it's also a playback issue as well when you're trying to play back or you're trying to preview it. So let me just clear all my cache and everything here. So I'm just going to clear the cache so that everything gets flushed and I can just play this back. Now check how long it takes for us to play back about 100 frames. So if I press play here, I'm going to put a counter in here. You're saying it's a great explanation? Of course it's a great explanation. I'm glad you think that. So I'm going to put a counter here and I'm going to press play. Okay, so this is 100 frames of multipass EXR. I'm going to press play. So I'm going to start my counter now and I'm going to play this back. And as you can see, it's doing about 2.5 frames per second of playback. It's reaching out 3 frames per second. So it is taking a substantial amount of time to do this playback. Like it's already like taking this much amount of time. So already taking 24 seconds. It's probably going to take close to 30 by the time I'm over. So now it's going to play back in real time just for this frame. And now you see 45 seconds it took to play back that clip. Now if I go to the other comp, so I'm going to reset this timer. It was 35 seconds before. I'm going to start the timer now. And this is how long it took to play back this clip. So it ran basically at 70 frames per second and it took 6 seconds. So you see the EXR with just one pass took about 6 seconds versus 36 seconds that it took with all the passes. So you see the biggest issue with this is not just the network issue, but it's also the problem of your machine. So if you have a hard drive that is not fast enough, like if you're comping onto a hard drive that is USB 3 or it only has 100 megs and then you're gonna have a problem. You see, that's the issue. It's so much more efficient working this way because Nuke, when it's playing back all of this, when it's trying to play back all of this, it's basically caching what it needs and it picks up what it needs. You see, I can play back this comp at 10 frames per second pretty much. Obviously, don't forget that I have a very extreme machine, okay? Just to give you an idea of how extreme it is. Cache, I have a solid state RAID system with 4 M2 drives. If I, for example, go into my caching network, caching RAID, which is my RAID, which is 4 M2 blades. If I try to cache it, you see I'm getting around 7,000 megs a sec and around 8,000 megs a sec on read and write. So if you were running this on a regular hard drive, so for example, if I was running on my desktop, for example, now my desktop is not rated. My desktop is just the regular solid state from Apple. If I go to my desktop, then I only get 3,000 megs a sec of of read and 3000 megs a sec of write. That's of course much slower. It's half the speed. And then if I go into my this thing, because I didn't show you this thing here, you see, that's a LASC 12 big. That's a RAID system with 12 hard drives. This thing here would be my media center, which is 48 terabytes, and that one is even slower. So this one does about 1000 megs, and it might do 1800. So the important thing to think about here is you need to look at your infrastructure. You need to look at how fast can you actually run your network. You need to use, for example, if I do a network location, let me for example do my machine, this machine, the render one. So if I do a speed test on this one, I'm only getting 94 megs a sec. So you see, this is a network drive. So this is a network machine. So obviously the problem here is that if I was running that EXR with 48 megs, the problem was that it wouldn't even be able to read two of them. So if I had two EXRs, if I had two artists, or if I had two EXRs of multipass EXR, I would clog my network. I hope that answered your question. I know it took a long time for me to answer, but I hope that answered the question. That ends the tip of the day, okay?